Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I produce these videos weekly for a twofold purpose, the first of which is just to help move my brain out of the mode of working with the text and processing it and doing background work and all that stuff over the course of the week to moving into the actual mode of writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation on Sunday. And the second reason is just to allow you, the viewer, who have stumbled across this video for whatever reason, whether you are a first-time viewer or you tune in every week, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text. This particular Sunday, which is November 8th, 2015, the 24th Sunday after Pentecost, our assigned gospel text is Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. Some background on this particular portion of Mark. The setting for this short passage is during Jesus' final week of life, between the triumphal entry, which is Palm Sunday, and then Good Friday and Easter. So this is occurring in the setting of Holy Week, even though we are about as far away from Holy Week as we can be right now. And Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's there for the festival of Passover, which was a very common occurrence. And a very healthy chunk of Mark's gospel is actually aimed at this week. He gets there, and of course I'm blanking. Right at the end of chapter 11 is when Jesus and the disciples arrive in Jerusalem. And actually, I think it's even earlier than that. Excuse me. It's actually the beginning of chapter 11. My background is failing me today. But from chapter 11 through Mark is 16 chapters, and that all occurs over the course of that final week, leading into the resurrection at the very tail end in chapter 16. So a healthy chunk of Mark's gospel is aimed at this week, and there's a lot of back and forth. A lot happens during this week, and a lot of it is pretty antagonistic. And that's what we see going on here in chapter 12. Jesus is in the temple. That's kind of what he does when he comes into town. He hangs out at the temple. Now, the temple was a building itself, but it was also a gigantic, great big courtyard in the middle of Jerusalem. So there's a lot of interaction that goes on there. There's a lot of activity that goes on there, and that's kind of a daily occurrence. But especially during the Passover, there would be, there's countless Jewish people who have come there, who have pilgrimaged there from around the nation in order to celebrate the festival. So there was a lot of activity. Now, during this time that Jesus is in the temple, he tends to be teaching a lot, also butting heads a lot with the religious elite. And this is nothing new. We see this kind of thing constantly. But that's kind of what's going on. And in particular, here in chapter 12, it's the scribes that he's going after. Now, the scribes are probably best described as the keepers of the law, the experts in the law. They would be like the seminary professors. So not necessarily the Pharisees or the Sadducees that we oftentimes hear about, who were a religious sect and definitely very high up within the community, the religious community. But the scribes were like the keepers of the law. So they were the teachers. They were the ones who knew Mosaic law inside and out. So that has kind of been his target, or his main adversary here through chapter 12. And it kind of goes back and forth quite a bit. Now, interestingly enough, about midway through the chapter, one of the scribes comes up and starts talking with Jesus, and we hear that as the question of good teacher, what must I do, or what is the most important commandment? And that's presented a little bit differently in the other gospels, but here it's one of the scribes, and Jesus replies with, well, you know it, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe's like, this is wise, this is truthful, this is more important than any sacrifice that we can ever make. And Jesus says to the scribe, surely you are not far from the kingdom, or the kingdom is not far from you. So that has been going on. And then there's this weird little exchange about who is greater, the Messiah or David. And that's a throwback to the high, opinion that everyone has of David being the one faithful king, or the best, the epitome of the faithful, God-loving king. But so that's all going on, and then that leads us to this text. Now, interestingly enough, in this short little text, only like 7 verses, there's 2 different sections, and they're kind of related and they're kind of not. Okay, so we'll get into it after 5 minutes of introduction. Let's actually get into the text. As he, being Jesus, taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite of the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Okay, so that's the gospel in its entirety. And at first it seems like they're connected because of the thing about the widows. But I hear this, and immediately it screams in my brain stewardship, stewardship, stewardship. It's about money. It's about how do we be cheerful givers? How do we follow the example of the widow who gave all that she had? And one direction that a sermon could go with this is how are we good stewards? How do we not give out of what's comfortable? And I'm not just talking money here, but how do we give of our talents? How do we give of our time? How do we give of ourselves? Do we give out of what's comfortable, like the rich people were, who, yeah, they gave a whole bunch of money, but they could afford to? Or do we give everything? Do we put in everything that we have, everything that we are, like the poor widow did? That's kind of I think the go-to interpretation of this text. I think that's okay. I don't really like it. I think there's way more than that going on here. Yes, that could be used as a way to enhance the notion of stewardship. Unfortunately, I think it could also be taken the wrong direction and into something that they call prosperity gospel, which is a tendency with a lot of televangelists who are like, hey, if you want to be faithful, give more, give more, give more. And the more faithful you are in giving to God, the more God's going to bless you. So basically, hey, I need a new jet, so give to that and God will bless you. I tend to get a little bit snarky when it comes to televangelists of that nature. So my apologies if you happen to be one, but I don't like what you do. But that's just me being judgmental. So, okay. Coming off of that tangent, the other connection between these 2 things is, of course, the notion of motivation. Like Jesus says, beware of the scribes who wear the long robes, because that was a status symbol, and they walk through the synagogues and they like to be greeted with honor, and they expect the seat of honor in the banquets and in the synagogues, and they devour widows' houses. And I think that little tiny snippet perhaps sheds a little bit more light on the second part when he's at the treasury and he sees this poor widow, that the system is flawed. Throughout this whole chapter and throughout a lot of this, Jesus is working on tearing down the system, that God is entering into this reality to remove the hindrances from true relationship. And the system, as it was a hindrance, that there were all these steps that you had to go through to be in relationship with God and to be right with God. And the law, you had to do it to be right with God, and that was what was taught. And we know that we can't ever pull off all of these things because sin is just too deeply embedded within us, and that's why Jesus came to do something about it. But I think that's what's going on here with this passage. And when Jesus sees the poor woman put in all that she has, there's speculation within the scholars. And we don't know. We weren't sitting there. We don't know what his response really. Well, we know his response, but we don't know his motivation for it. We don't know what came next with this. We don't know what happens to the woman. And so some think that, like I said before, well, this is about stewardship, and he's telling his disciples, go all in. It's like a poker game. If you got a good hand, go all in. If it's worth it, go all in. And God is a life following God is worth it. That's one interpretation. The other one is that he's actually lamenting for this poor woman, that look, she has given all that she has, and now she has essentially cursed herself to either death or begging, because she's, as a widow, she has no one to care for her, and the system should be caring for her, and I think that's a throwback to the whole devouring widows' houses, instead of caring for the widows, which is what they should be doing, caring for the needy within their midst. The expectation is that you always give, that you have to give to something bigger than you. So instead of being cared for, they're trying to care, and it costs them everything. And that's what we see with this widow. So is Jesus lamenting the system? Maybe so. I think so. And especially what's interesting is what follows this up. Immediately following this is the end of chapter 12. And as we go into chapter 13, Jesus walks out of the temple with the disciples. And the disciples are like, oh, look at how wonderful this is. The beautiful stones and the artwork, and look at all this. And Jesus says, I tell you, very soon, one stone will not lie on another. This temple will be torn down. And actually, by the time the Gospels were written down, the destruction of the temple had probably already happened. It happened in about 70 AD, so about 35-ish years after Jesus' resurrection. So it's very likely already happened by the time the Gospels are written down. So this notion that the system, that poor woman has just given all that she has to survive on, won't even matter. That soon the day is coming when this thing that we are all ingrained into to support and to give, to maintain, whatever, is not even going to be in existence anymore, because it's going to be destroyed. And you can go a lot of different directions with that, and it could be taken, if you interpret it this way, a shot at organized religion. It could be a shot at stewardship in terms of supporting a congregation, of supporting a building. It could go that way. It's not my intention for going that way, but it raises the question of what is our motivation, and what is the motivation of the group, not just the individual, but of the group. Are we caring for those who need it? Is that what we are using this for? Or are we doing this to perpetuate ourselves? And it gives me pause to bring that up, but usually things that give us pause are the things that kind of are hitting home. So maybe they're exactly what we need to be thinking about. That's what's happening in this passage. At face value, it could go one way, and if we dig a little deeper, it kind of seems to point another way. But again, it's all interpretation, and how do we hear it? And the wonderful thing about the Word of God is it's living and active, and it can strike one person one way, and it can strike another person another way, and that's what we need to remember. So this video is a little bit shorter than normal, but you know what? That's okay, because it's a short passage, and that's kind of where I'm leaning with it. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments of your own, please by all means share those down in the comment section, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week, and God bless.